Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Steve Gay, Interim Associate Dean of Medical Student Education, and welcome to our session, Navigating Polarity, the second of a number of community conversations concerning the complex societal issues that impact our role as physicians and create challenges concerning the delivery of healthcare and the development of policy that will impact our efforts to serve our society. Throughout this pandemic, communication and understanding has been increasingly strained as we struggle under greater pressures to serve and face greater challenges from those that think and believe differently from ourselves. We have been asked to be open and engaged despite our personal beliefs and opinions, but that is difficult when a free exchange of thoughts and ideas feels challenged. As an academic institution, we remain committed to the open and fair engagement of all thoughts and ideas. In so many ways, we must be in order to protect this for everyone. This is a critical part of the professional practices that we must navigate. For this session, we have the scholarly perspective from Dr. Julia Minson of the Harvard Kennedy School, and from the practical perspective from Kevin Hawkins of the Federal Mediation Service. They, with us, will explore how we effectively navigate polarity. These two practitioners regularly work together on these issues and will be co-presenting this evening. Without further ado, Julia, Kevin, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gay. Thank you for having us. It's a real pleasure to be here. My name is Julia Minson. Thank you for that introduction. Kevin, you want to introduce yourself briefly?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Gay, and thank you, Michigan community, for welcoming this Notre Dame graduate to share with you this evening. And we look forward to what we have to share with you, and also to be able to interact and answer some of your questions.
So maybe I will start us off a little bit by sharing a little bit about my own research, and I'm going to attempt the famous Zoom trick of sharing slides, see if it works for me. It is never guaranteed. Oh, look at that. All right, so I am a social psychologist by training. I came to the Kennedy School via the Department of Psychology at Stanford. And a lot of my work over the years has addressed the questions that Dr. Gay posed in his introduction, which is how can we really thoughtfully, respectfully, deeply engage with people when their views and their opinions and their values and even their beliefs about sort of what's true and what's false seem to be at odds with our own. When I look around the world today, to me, it seems like, the very fabric of democracy is fraying before our eyes. And part of the reason for that, in my opinion, is that we have such a hard time talking to others who we don't see eye to eye with. So a lot of my research over the years has been dedicated to sort of really defining and understanding and measuring this idea that we've come to call receptiveness to opposing views. Now, I put this definition of receptiveness up here because I think it's really important to think about exactly what we mean by that. So there's a lot of research in social psychology that basically says that whenever people encounter views that are different from their own, they tend to treat those views differently. So we tend to avoid views that don't align with ours. We tend to give them less time in our mental processes, and we tend to judge them differently, right? If I'm evaluating how true or false something is, or how relevant or irrelevant it is, a lot of that judgment comes with, does it actually support my prior beliefs or not? And so when we talk about receptiveness to opposing views, we're really thinking about the way people process information in terms of these sequential stages, right? First, I have to access the information, then I have to consider it, which basically just means I need to kind of noodle on it, right? Like let it percolate in my mind. And then I need to evaluate it and I need to decide, is this good or bad? Is this true or false? Do I want to take this into consideration or not? And so the way we define receptiveness is as a willingness to access, consider, and evaluate supporting and opposing views in a relatively impartial manner. Now, when we say relatively impartial, we mean not completely unbiased, because what we found is that almost nobody is completely unbiased. People have an incredibly difficult time giving as much mental space to ideas they disagree with as they do to ideas they do agree with. But what we see with people who are more receptive in the way they process information is that the bias is smaller, right? There's less of a gap between the amount of information they take in from both perspectives, the amount of time they spend thinking about both sides, and the ultimate conclusions that they reach about both sides. Now, another part of this definition that I think is really important and that we've thought really hard about is what's not here. And what's not here is any mention of changing your views, right? So when we say somebody is receptive, we don't mean that this is a person who might compromise. We don't mean that this is a person who is going to sort of change their mind and abandon their values. We strictly think of receptiveness in terms of being willing to cognitively engage with information. And so that was sort of the way we thought about the idea. What we then did is we went ahead and we made up a way of measuring it, right? Turns out that some people are more receptive than others. And you can imagine, think about the people in your life. You can readily think of the people who seem to listen really well and people who don't listen so well. Well, now you can give them a score if that makes you feel better. So we published a scale of receptiveness to opposing views. It's 18 questions. All of these questions have sort of the structure that you can see up on the screen, from strongly agree to strongly disagree. And when you add them all up, you can have your own score. And if you want to know how receptive you are, you can go to this website. So this is receptiveness.net. And this is a website that my research group and I put together. And there is a button on top that says take the quiz. And you can take the quiz and you can measure your own receptiveness, and you can print out your results. You can post them on Twitter, or you can just show them to your romantic partner and say, see, I told you, I'm extremely receptive. I'm very, very good at this. So that has been a lot of my academic work. And what I love talking to Kevin about is how those types of ideas play out in the real world, and how mediators see these processes and whether it's at all similar to how academics see them.
Well, Julia, what you said is really interesting. And I go back to the definition about access, consider, and evaluating opposing views. And my profession has been to access, consider, and evaluate opposing views in an impartial manner in order to serve the clients and also have them put their trust in me to facilitate a conversation. And then I think about what my purpose is in accessing, consider, and evaluate. And that is to help the party, well, first of all, to help myself understand the perspective and what's important to each party, but then to function as a conduit between the parties to help them better understand each other. So then my purpose is not competitive, and I am not cleaved to one ideology or another. It's just to create an atmosphere of understanding.
That's really, really interesting. So, one of the things that we've noticed as we've studied this is that people have such a hard time being receptive even when they want to be. And one of the experiences I've had working with the Federal Mediation Service is that mediators almost serve like a joining part where, the two parts of the brain can't agree. So they serve as a conduit to make the ideas flow across.
Yeah, I think that's a great metaphor because the two sides of the brain are vibrating at completely different frequencies. And to get them in alignment, we do actually function as a conduit that goes between, to help them communicate in a place where they have lost the ability to actually communicate or translate information, because they get to that point of intransigence where I don't care what you say or how you say it, I am not accepting it. And so then the challenge for the mediator is, how do you move beyond that intransigence to receptiveness?
I find it really interesting what you just said there, is this idea of, I'm not accepting it, which I think is language that we use a lot when we're in disagreement and in conflict. And it's sort of this language of pushing and pulling, right? Like, I am going to push my idea on you, and I'm going to convince you why I'm right. And I'm going to, therefore, by definition, convince you that you're wrong, right? And it's sort of back to that idea that receptiveness does not require people to change their minds. I think a lot of the times people feel that in order to have a conversation, like the only purpose of having a conversation is that somebody has to change their mind. And so if I'm never going to change my mind, and I know you're never going to change your mind, then what's the point of even talking to each other?
Well, the purpose of the conversation is really a key. It's something that I hone in on as a practitioner, because my purpose as a mediator is to help build relationships between parties, to help the parties understand each other, to find a platform upon common ground where they can really consider the merits of their perspective as well as considering the merits of the other's perspective. So then persuasion takes a back seat. Competing for victory in the argument takes a back seat to learning, and learning is very powerful. So if I can get people to understand the power of learning and understanding the perspective, we can have a better quality of interaction and a more substantial conversation.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I love talking about purpose and, goals that people have in conversation. Quite often when I teach executive students, sometimes I ask them to sort of list what are all the reasons why a person would talk to somebody they strongly disagree with. And what surprises them is how quickly they can fill up an entire sort of chalkboard with different ideas for why you would talk to somebody you disagree with. All right. We all start out with, well, I want to tell them how wrong they are. And then like 15 minutes in, we've generated all these different reasons, including learning from their perspective, including trying to maintain the relationship, trying to solve some joint problem, trying to understand how they came to believe what they believe. And so there's this really long list that people don't often jump to when they're in the middle of the conversation, right? What they jump to is, I need to tell the other person why they're so wrong.
So one of the things and one of the purposes that I have is I want people to hear me. And in order for them to hear me, they have to feel like they're heard. And so then in signaling that I'm hearing, then I have to actually show interest in what they're sharing. And there are certain behaviors we can talk about, as we will a little later on, to actually show interest. I have to show them that I understand their perspective, and I'm considering their perspective. And as a mediator, when I'm working with parties to bridge that gap, I have to plant seeds and give those seeds a chance to germinate, for people to think about those things. So, and those seeds are also planted with certain behaviors, and not out and out challenging, because I think, Julia, what you're talking about is a reflexive type of piece where automatically someone says something that hits a hot button, and my reaction is to challenge that premise. And in order to get people to dig deeper, you have to actually want to dig deeper. And you have to ask the right questions at the right time, and you have to really listen. And I'll
Okay.
tell you, so one of the things I was thinking about it, if I'm having a conversation about racism, and I want to, my objective, and it's always keeping your eye on the prize, your purpose, what's your objective? My objective is that I would like to end racism. But in order to do that, in my experience, I have to understand how a person with an opposing view feels. So then I have to invest in that understanding first, rather than my pontification.
That's a really profound claim, right? And I feel like, I spend a lot of time thinking about why people are not more receptive, right? So what we found, what we found in our research is, a lot of evidence of like the benefits of receptiveness. We, came up with the definition, we created the scale, and then once we can measure things, we can measure all kinds of things that come out of being more receptive. And so, we found all these benefits, right? So people who are more receptive actually see and read more things from both sides of the aisle, and they're much better at paying attention to content on both sides. They don't sort of like willfully tune out. They're more accurate in their evaluations of different arguments. They have better friendship networks, like they have friends from both sides of the ideological spectrum, and people get that and they want to be friends with them. And so there's this whole sort of laundry list of benefits of receptiveness, which always gets me to this question of why don't people do it more often? And I think you just pointed out two really profound reasons. One is that it just takes incredible patience, right? So when you talk about planting seeds, it takes a long time to plant those seeds and then to wait for them to sprout. And often when we're in conflict, I personally just have, I have such an urge to get it over with. Right. So I have teenage daughters, and you have given me a lot of parenting advice over the time we've known each other. And I struggle. I struggle to have the patience. And then the second thing you said that I think is also just incredibly profound is that a lot of reason that people are that people don't want to be receptive or sort of are worried about being receptive is, what if it spreads really terrible ideas? Like, what if by listening to this person, I'm really elevating this completely unacceptable rhetoric? And I think it's really interesting to think about, when is that true, and how true is it?
Well, what I look at is people need to be able to tell their story. And in order to reach them, I have to understand their story. And sometimes, and please forgive the metaphor, people will just vomit all over you. They have this thing that they need to expel. And so you have to be able to be patient enough to let them expel that and let it run its course. And that you have to be receptive enough to pick out the bits of value. And I hope that didn't gross anybody out, but it's true, because
it's a medical school, they can handle it.
Because people do, they have so much that is pent up, especially with the plethora of hot button issues that we've been going through these last few years. There are a lot of very strong feelings and very strong emotions. And we have to be able to sift through the emotionality to find the truths that these people hold close. So then you have to be able to weather that storm and think about things as they go.
And so what do you think about, so the patience one is really hard for me, but I feel like I'm working on it. I'm working on my willpower, and I think it's a really, I think it's a deep, I'm sort of joking a little bit, but also I think it's a really interesting psychological insight. I sort of invite anybody in the audience who is thinking about this deeply, next time you hear something that you disagree with, and it doesn't even have to be, it doesn't have to be a profound social issue. It can be, something completely trivial. Notice how hard it is to not contradict it immediately. Like the next time somebody tells you that vanilla ice cream is better than chocolate ice cream, see if you can take a 3-second pause before you express your contrarian opinion. And I think there's something really interesting about the urgency of that moment and the need to set the record straight. But I think the second thing you said, I also want to push on a little bit is, this idea of, if I'm talking to this person and they're talking about something that I just find morally abhorrent, right? And some third party is looking on. Do we need to worry that third party is going to say, well, Kevin must be okay with some amount of racism because here he is talking to this racist? Do we worry about creating that impression? Because I certainly feel like my students worry about it.
Well, that's actually really, really interesting, because I don't think you can worry about, first of all, what other people are thinking. What I want to do is create that connection with that individual. And so as I'm creating that connection, the person that's watching from the outside will see my curiosity. If they're listening, well, they'll hear the questions that I'm asking. They'll see my reframing and showing respectful, thoughtful behaviors in human interaction. Because I think that's a very powerful point when you have these issues that escalate or foster great emotion. Often humanity and reason leaves the conversation, and then you are stuck. There's no place to go. So what I'm believing people will see is my humanizing that interaction and creating a certain environment of receptiveness and consideration and respect. And I think that's a key thing. People mistake receptiveness and humanity with agreement. And I'm just exhibiting curiosity, because in order for me to be successful in creating some sort of connection, either for understanding or to plant a seed, I have to have patience with the process, and it has a rhythm to it. And often our impatience disrupts the rhythm of the conversation. So there's a self-awareness piece, and you talked about it. You can feel it going up to here, and you get impatient, and you're like, oh, I'm just going to burst, and you have to have a degree of self-mastery. So a lot of this is introspective, and I would submit perhaps the most powerful piece of this is the introspective piece. Am I even able to be self-aware, to know where my emotions are going, where my mind is going? And do I have the mastery to keep my eye on the prize? And that prize is connection and understanding. And then that means I have to listen, I have to consider, and even maybe my perspective may evolve based upon what I learn.
Yeah, I think you and I are certainly in agreement. So another thing that I think has come up, and I just want to flag it a little bit, is this idea that one of the reasons that people have such a hard time being receptive is that they have a difficult time showing their receptiveness to their counterparts, right? So we it's interesting because a lot of the times when we talk about receptiveness, and this was a lot of the work that has evolved and sort of emerged in my lab in the last 5 years, we came into this work thinking about receptiveness as like an internal thing that lives in people's brains, right? So, and the definition, as I laid it out for you initially, and the scale as I laid it out for you, very much has that flavor, that this is an internal psychological construct. You can think about it like, your level of anxiety or your level of extroversion. It's sort of a tendency that lives in your mind, right? And then one of the things that we figured out, and maybe mediators knew this all along, but it certainly took, academics a beat to get there, is that it's an interactive process, right? You're never receptive sort of sitting by yourself in your room. You always have to be receptive to somebody who is saying something you disagree with. And so to the extent that that's true, in some ways it only matters if they know that that's what you're attempting, right? So, like I have these, arguments with my husband all the time when I'm like, you're not listening to me. And, he's like looking off into the ceiling as I'm talking. And eventually he turns to me and says, yeah, I am listening to you. Like, this is my listening face. I look at the ceiling to think hard about what you said. Right. And so he thinks he's listening to me. And I have to believe that he actually is. But the look of it doesn't convey listening. And so there's this miscommunication where one person is really trying, but the other person isn't giving them credit for it because the receptiveness is not visible. It is inside of their head. And so, a lot of the things that we have been working on, and, what I've sort of discovered that mediators do all the time is use behaviors that visibly signal that I'm engaging and I'm listening and I'm paying attention, so that you aren't just sort of being receptive in your own head, you're actually showing it to your counterpart so that the interaction can benefit from the effort you're making.
I think when we have conversations with people that have a different perspective than ours, a lot of time people are expecting to be met with conflict, or they're expecting a contrary response. And I think it's funny you mentioned your husband, because my wife would maybe say the same things, that I may not look like it because I'm fairly stoic, or I may not even be making eye contact. I'm listening and I'm considering, because I want what comes out of my mouth to be productive and to be reasonable. But I also have to show this person, be my wife or anyone else, that I want to understand. So how do I show them I want to understand? Well, the first question I may have about an issue is what do you believe about this issue? And then, because it's very easy to slip into opinion and feeling, what's a more productive avenue is to ask people to tell their story. And in doing so, you ask them, what experience or experiences have you had that led you to form this belief? And when I think all of us love to tell our story, and that's a very disarming thing when you invite people to tell their story. And then we go beyond competing opinions or feelings that are on opposite sides to, wow, I'm telling you're really interested in me because you want to hear my story. And then as you listen to the story, you can ask questions for clarification or to extract more detail, because what I need to know is, what is the genesis of your belief? What's the genesis of your perspective? I want to know if it's something that you've held, something that you've researched, or if you are cleaved to an ideology or someone else's opinion, because that will dictate the direction I go next in the next questions that I will ask to probe, or perhaps a seed that I will plant to make you consider the merits of your perspective. And
That's
also, and also then, based on what I learn, it may plant a seed in me to consider the merits of my own perspective.
Well, and I mean, I think that's so interesting because, I'm hearing a couple of things, right? I'm hearing asking questions and sort of, not the kinds of questions that we often hear in debates, which are some version of, what kind of idiot are you to believe X, Y, Z, right? Like that's a question, but it's not really the kind of question we're talking about, right? We're talking about questions that exhibit curiosity, and then asking people to tell their story. And from that story, also challenging your own assumptions about why they believe what they believe, right? I think a lot of us, when we're confronted with views we strongly disagree with, we jump to your belief is founded on ideology and your belief is founded on misinformation. And if I can just get all that wrongheadedness out of your head, then we'll be good to go, right? And turns out that most people are by far more complicated than that.
Well, it's you touch on a great point, because often we get into these polarized conversations because I feel I have either the moral high ground or the intellectual high ground. And so if I'm looking and I'm taking the high ground, this person is going to see that you don't think I'm your equal. You think I'm a knuckle-dragging ignoramus who has no idea what they're talking about. And that is not going to get me to listen to you. As a matter of fact, that's going to get me to dig in deeper. Right. Or we have competition because we both think, and this is what most often happens, we both think we have the moral high ground, and we both think we have the intellectual high ground. So we both got this posture that inhibits us from truly communicating.
So, and you know what, here's what's really hard about that. What's really hard about that is that, and this is, I think this is what a lot of research shows on, a variety of topics, but here it's sort of really vivid, is in any one argument, right? When I have an opinion and it's different than your opinion, by definition, I think I'm right. Because if I didn't think I was right, then I wouldn't have my opinion, right? So it's really, really hard at any one time to not claim the intellectual high ground, because I wouldn't be having this conversation if I didn't believe that my side was correct. And the thing that's really tricky is that, when both people believe that, from their perspective in that moment, it makes perfect sense. But it's very, very hard for both of them to be right at the same time, especially when they have, seemingly opposing views. And so, when we study this as researchers, you can see that, in a population overall, there's a lot of bias, right? Because everybody thinks they're right, and that can't possibly be true. But any one person feels like this is the one time when I am definitely right. And it's it takes a lot of effort to keep in mind that your counterpart is actually thinking that exact same thing right now.
No, I agree, because and I've had these types of conversations with people that are close to me. So my experience is not limited to trying to mediate clients. As a matter of fact, I'll go home and my wife will say, Kevin Hawkins, don't try and mediate me. What she wants to have is a receptive conversation, right, and something that we should have. And so in looking at that, I have to check myself to make sure my priorities are in order. With people that I care about, do I care more about being right or winning, or do I care about the quality of our relationship? And so in examining that aspect, what am I doing to continue the cultivation of our relationship, despite the fact that we have a fundamental disagreement about something we feel very strongly about? It can happen with a person on the street. You know, and you could hear someone say something that is pretty incendiary from your perspective. And how do you respond to that in time? What is your, and think about what is your purpose in responding to that?
So that I feel like that's something that we can help people with, both with sort of the mediator wisdom and the research insights, right? I mean, part of the problem we have these days is that people are confronted with these topics and these conversations in every sphere of their life. And most of them don't have the training to actually rise to the occasion, right? We've, you know, sort of sitting back from this type of conversation, most of us have some sense of what the right thing to do is. But the point you made about self-mastery is really important. Most of us don't have the self-mastery to sound receptive and show curiosity and solicit people's stories and really engage with their perspective kind of in that hot moment. And so some of the work that we've been doing in my lab has been really trying to create a toolkit for people to be able to do that. The idea is that, you know, receptiveness only matters when the other person can tell that this is what you're doing. And so what we wanted to do was basically use natural language processing. So, you know, algorithms that analyze large databases of language to understand what are the actual words that people can say so that their counterpart feels heard. Right? So instead of saying, how can you be more receptive in your own brain? We are saying, can we identify specific words and phrases that make the other person say, hey, this person is really listening to me. They're really trying. It's essentially trying to, you know, short circuit years of mediation training or years of family therapy and say, can we give people like a quick little shortcut? And so we call this approach conversational receptiveness. And what it does is it's literally made up of specific words and phrases that we identified by writing a computational algorithm. And we found that we can train people on this stuff, and it strongly predicts conflict outcomes. So we can, you know, pair up total strangers to have conversations about campus sexual assault or the Black Lives Matter movement, like really, really hot button topics. And when one side is trained in conversational receptiveness, the other side sees them as more reasonable and more trustworthy. They're more willing to talk to them in the future. They basically think they're just a more sensible person. And the funny thing about this is I'm going to show you the list of words and phrases. But the funny thing about it is that people also tend to imitate each other's linguistic style. So, you know, and again, everybody can sort of think back to their last heated interaction, and you know that people kind of respond in kind. Quite often it's a negative spiral, right? Once you start raising your voice, the other person starts raising their voice, but you can also make it go in the opposite direction. So to the extent that you use conversational receptiveness, the other side can use conversational receptiveness as well. The way we developed this was by writing a natural language processing algorithm that identified, you know, specific features of speech that are correlated with perceptions of receptiveness. which means that in the beginning, we're talking about like 30 or 40 different cues of receptiveness. And that seemed to be sort of way too much for anybody to remember ever. So we boiled it down to basically 4 things. And the 4 things are easy to remember because they follow an acronym HEAR, as in I hear you. So here are kind of the 4 things that I think people should take notes on, and that will kind of get them on the path to being better at this a little bit faster. So the first thing is what we call hedging your claims. So hedging phrases are things like, I think it's possible that, or this might happen because, or some people tend to think. So all of these words, right, all these phrases include like a little bit of uncertainty. In an argument, we often have a real tendency to make very dogmatic claims, right? The COVID vaccine is safe and effective, which it is, right? But you're better off saying something like, most evidence suggests that the COVID vaccine is safe and effective, right? It invites less counter arguing from the other party. The E stands for emphasizing agreement. And this is something that, I've heard you talk about a lot, is finding common ground, right? And the common ground might be something as simple as, we both want to have a good conversation, right? Or we both want to address this problem, or I agree with some of what you're saying. So, people often like worry about the E because you don't want to say that you agree with the thing that you disagree with. But the idea is that all of us can agree on some things, right? All of us can agree that we want a safe and thriving planet for our children to live on. We want people to feel respected in every interaction they have. We might disagree about how we get there, but there's some very common values that we can all sort of reach for to, find the E. The A is acknowledgement. So we've talked about acknowledgement a lot, sort of recognizing with your words that you've heard the other person, right? So acknowledgement phrases are things like, I understand that, or I see your point, or what I think you're saying is. So, quite often I hear this a lot from students, and especially people who've been in the corporate world for a little bit, who say things like, oh, I've taken so many leadership trainings where, you're always supposed to say, I understand that. And it's so annoying because of course they don't really understand. And I always say, you can't end at I understand that. You have to show that you understand it. You have to finish the rest of the sentence with a demonstration of actual understanding. But this is sort of a good way to remember that understanding is really incredibly important. And the R is reframing to the positive, which is to say that any message can be phrased in positive or negative terms, right? And so instead of, saying things like, I can't do this because it's not possible, you can say things like, I would really prefer to do this other thing because that would be very helpful. So things, so here's some suggestion phrases. I think it's great when, I really appreciate it when, and it would be so wonderful if. So here, is what we've been using with a lot of our students. And in fact, I've been doing some work with healthcare providers and teaching them to use HEAR with patients who want things that they're not supposed to get, like, antibiotics for their colds, for example. And it's a really useful toolkit when you're extremely limited on time and you can't, spend hours really sort of unpacking somebody's thoughts and feelings on an issue, but you want to quickly demonstrate that you're paying attention. So that's been our shortcut that we've been offering folks for these conversations.
I think it's a very powerful tool. It's something some of us use instinctively, but I think it's something that many of us need to slow down. And that's another thing that happens when we get into these issues. We have a tendency to speed up. And what does it do? It runs us smack dab into the conflict and into a posture of escalation. If you hedge your claim, you're not actually sticking or drawing a line in the sand or saying, no further, you're not, in Lord of the Rings. It's one of those things that I think is very important. And in my professional life, we use that in terms of a mediator's supposal. So what do you suppose if this happened, or what would this look like if we did this? And then you get people to think about possibilities. And that's really what you want to do, get people to think about possibilities, and then emphasizing agreement. That is, even if it's a small little thing, that's the first plank in the bridge. And what you want to do is start to have plank after plank of small agreements to build into a larger environment of agreement. And an important thing to do there is to acknowledge the perspectives or the merits of the perspectives of other people. If something in the way, don't let your cleaving to an ideology get in the way of using a tool for connection. Because if it resonates, and who are you lying to except yourself if you don't accept that something resonates? And then reframing to the positive sets the focus and direction of the conversation. Because what we're hedging to, and that gets back to purpose. And while you're going through these 4 steps of here, your purpose may shift intentionally or unintentionally based on what you hear, based on the response of the other people. So your purpose may not be the same as when you began the conversation. And you have to be able to be nimble enough to and humble enough to be able to make that shift. And because it often happens organically over the course of a conversation.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I love that. I love that point, because I think people, people often go into these conversations without a purpose. They just sort of, trip into them, right? Somebody says something they disagree with and off we go. And second, I don't think we notice enough how the purpose changes. And we don't sort of recognize that could be good or bad because we don't see it happening. So I think that's really interesting. So I think that we've given folks a lot of stuff to think about. And I would love to hear any thoughts or reflections or questions from the group here. There is a chat Q&A function. And we'd love to hear what anybody is thinking about all this stuff. And if we can sort of elaborate on anything, or if there's any counter arguments anybody wants to make. We're not particularly delicate people. So if anybody thinks that this is just all completely wrong, we're very happy to hear that perspective as well. While some questions are being typed, I got to ask you this. So what do you do when people just don't want to see eye to eye? When you've done all the things and then it's just not happening?
So I'll answer that from 2 perspectives. First, from the professional perspective, it's okay to let it breathe. You share, you plant the seed, and you give it some space. We tend to reflexively want to press in and get to the point where we have some sort of agreement, or the point where I'm winning. And what that does is it creates pressure. And it's just like Play-Doh. You push it together and it just oozes between your fingers. So then no agreement is going to happen the more you press. So you have to let it breathe.
I think that's really interesting. It makes me think of two things. I mean, one, you have just the best metaphors, and they're all like parenting metaphors. It's all, vomit and Play-Doh. The other thing that it makes me think about what you just said is that sometimes, and I just sort of discovered this fairly recently, is you can come back to things when they didn't go well. Like I have these interactions sometimes, especially in the classroom. I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I said that in front of 60 people, and then, you kind of want to never go there again, but then there's nothing wrong with coming back 3 days later and saying, well, look, here's what happened the other day, and here's what I was thinking about. And I'm sorry I didn't handle it as well as I could have, but now on reflection, here is a conversation I'd like to have, or a question I'd like to ask, right? So like sometimes you can't handle it in the moment perfectly, and it's okay to come back and kind of name the fact that you didn't handle and explicitly, ask the other folks involved for another chance. Okay, we have some questions. We have some actual questions in the chat here.
Okay.
So there was somebody who posed a question in advance in the registration. And the question is, what would be the most inclusive and sensitive way to begin having a conversation? That's a good one.
I always start a conversation with asking people about them and not the issue. I want to show, and sincerely show, interest in them as a person. Who are you? Where are you from? What do you like? Tell me about a hobby. Is there something? I do things like that to start the rhythm of telling our stories. But I may start first because people are often really hesitant, even when invited to tell their story. So I will tell my story first, and then set a tone where I'm fearless and I'm transparent, and I will tell you my story, where I'm from, some of the things I like, and let's just be two people. Let's talk that way. And that's how I start the rhythm. Then I invite them to tell their personal story, because oftentimes we rush to the issue and we haven't created any rhythm, and we don't know each other at all. So all I am is an opposition or a stranger instead of a human being that's sitting before you. And I also want to go back to your previous point. There's incredible power in humility and incredible power in an apology. When people see that, that also sets a tone, because that means you've moved past your pride and you've moved past any fears that you may have, to say, I think the connection with you is more important than those things. And so those are very, very powerful.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think, I think even when you get to the issue, right, people sometimes are very skittish. And I think it's okay to, again, name that and say, look, I know that this is a sensitive topic that people often don't like to talk about, but I'm just really curious about how you think about X, Y, and Z. I think we might have different perspectives, and I'd really like to understand yours. Right. And so there's just all of that is asking questions and sort of like showing curiosity with neon signs. I'm so curious. I really want to understand you. right?
Mhm.
Which is very different than saying, here are the 7 reasons why I believe what I believe. Now tell me why I'm wrong, right? That's how those conversations go really badly. All right, hold on. There's another question. So how have you experienced polarity and even extreme polarization in your everyday lives? And how are the impacts different personally and professionally? I think that's really like, that gets at a lot of things, right? Because there's so much going on right now in our country where, families are torn apart by their political beliefs. And especially I think with COVID, that became really prominent, right? Because there were like all kinds of things that we could not talk about before, right? Like you can go your whole life without, debating marijuana legalization with your grandparents, right? And that was fine. But you can't not talk about your vaccination status, for example. So there's just been more and more topics. And I think with people, being home and social media, there's more opportunity and almost like more occasions when we talk to people about hot button topics than we ever have before. I think the thing that's really hard with people who you're close with is that, the relationship is so important, right? You can't, or you certainly don't want to sort of, write them out of your life because they believe whatever they believe, right? If it was a stranger, you'd say, oh, well, I don't want to talk to this person ever again, I'm done. But that's not an option if it's a family member or a close friend. And then, the other thing that I think is really hard is that it's always a surprise. Like you always think of your friends or of your family as having the same beliefs as you. And then when they turn out not to have the same beliefs as you, then it's a real shocker. It's like, oh, I thought you were like one of the reasonable people, but it turns out, so I think, I mean, I think it's harder. I think with friends and family, it's harder than when you've got your professional hat on.
I 100% agree. Not that I'm not committed in my professional life to helping create an atmosphere of understanding and peace and agreement, but the stakes are not as high. I'm not waking up with that person the next day or interacting on a holiday or want to have a weekly conversation. So there's this confluence and sometimes a conflict of emotion that's present in our everyday life than in my professional life. So in my professional life, it's much easier for me to be objective. And when it's in your personal life, it's this close and you can't often see clearly. And I can tell you with all transparency and candor, with someone I love very much, we have incredibly opposite views on the vaccination issue. And we had incredibly, sometimes toxic conversations about it. And then I had to take a step back. What's the most important thing to me is that I love this person. So if I love this person, then how do I show my love? I hear their heart. And then I share my heart. And we both shared hearts and we still don't agree. Bless you.
Thank you.
So then I let it go. And this other person let it go. And there was peace. And so the purpose there was that we hear each other's hearts. And we're more invested in that in our relationship than we were about winning an argument. And it's an incredibly sad phenomenon when we see people disown family members because of their stance on a certain issue and lose sight of the value of that relationship.
One of the things it suggests me this reminds me of, so I teach negotiations at the Kennedy School. And in negotiations, we often talk about, what we call zero-sum negotiations, where it's sort of a tug of war, right? I want to buy low, you want to sell high, we're bargaining about over price, and then, one of us is going to get a good deal and one of us is not going to get a good deal. Or we talk about value creation, right? And the way we talk about value creation, all of this, right, is we think about how can you find win-win solutions for both sides. And the way I think all of that relates to receptiveness is that when we get into this sort of persuasion mode, and vaccines is a great example of it, we are now in this zero-sum space. Right. I will get you vaccinated, come hell or high water. And the only way you can get away from my attempts to persuade you is by, stopping and no longer answering the phone. But the kind of value creating version of that is starting to understand where the person is coming from. And is there some other solution that's sort of a third solution? Right. So if a person doesn't want to get vaccinated because they realize that COVID is a serious illness, but they've read some misinformation about the vaccines, maybe you can get them to mask more effectively, right? If a person doesn't want to get vaccinated because they hate being told what to do all the time, then telling them what to do is exactly the opposite of what will be effective, right? So, if your joint goal is to ensure health in a family, for example, there are other ways to do that besides having this kind of, battle of wills that will generally not result in anything positive. So it's back to sort of like understanding the why. Okay, we have more questions. I've figured out how the Q&A function works, so I'm finding all the questions now. So here's one. David, you are one of our panelists, so I don't know if you want to hop in and ask that question. If you want to vocalize your question about people with no self-awareness.
Yeah, happy to. I'm a behind the scenes panelist. You guys are the panelists, but what my question is, can you talk about how you would engage with the individual or individuals without self-awareness for their own actions and our grace for the perspective of others?
I think most of us have very limited self-awareness. That's kind of the whole thing. We're all pretty bad at this. I think that's actually a really key thing to keep in mind is, I often say that, look, if you think you're being objective, you're not. Like, you're just being human. We're all biased in many different ways. We're all kind of blind to how our actions impact other people. So I think probably step one is noticing where your own kind of the own contribution you've made to whatever difficult situation you're finding yourself in. And I think that's a hard one.
Well, I do this by maybe owning how that lack of self-awareness makes me feel in a certain situation. So, when you said that, it made me feel this way because it appeared to me that you didn't care about my feelings or you didn't care about understanding me. And my wife is really, really very good at this because sometimes I can have a blind spot because I hard as it may be believe I feel strongly about some things. And so owning that can give a person pause to think about what comes out of their mouth or how their face looks or things like that. And when you act like this, I don't think you're listening to me by what you said. I don't think you really care about hearing my perspective, because this is a behavior that you were displaying toward me. And so those are the things I do in the face of what you're talking about, David, is come from my own perspective and own my feelings about that. And we're not always perfect, because we're human, as you said, Julia, we get hurt. And sometimes we react from that place of woundedness instead of respond from a place of wanting to connect. And I think it's important that we give each other pause and think about how what we say makes us feel, and be able to reflect that back in a calm manner. But you also have to be able to read the room and the environment. Some people, I had a person text me from a football game in Cleveland that said, people are saying racist things behind me. I really want to say something. I said, stop. You're at a football game. They're drinking beer. What are the odds that it's not going to escalate? So you have to be able to sometimes let that go and understand that that's in that situation, you're not going to be hurt. Or you can try, you can probe and say, look, hey, buddy, you know, I understand you have a right to say what you want and do these things, but when you say stuff like that, it really hurts my feelings and it disturbs me. And based on their reaction or response, you will know whether you're dealing with a reasonable person and whether or not to just walk away.
I got some really good advice very recently from a mentor of mine. That was sort of along those lines. I was working really hard on a course and getting grief from some students. And my reaction was like, how can you guys, not appreciate this and that I'm doing? And why aren't you giving me more credit for all this hard work? And my mentor basically changed my tone and suggested that I ask for guidance, even though what I really wanted was to sort of go off on a good rant. And it was some version of, well, look, I'm really confused by, what you're hoping that I will do here, because I tried this and then I tried this, and that doesn't seem to be working. So can you help me understand what would work better? And honestly, like, I didn't expect to hear anything valuable. And then I did. Then they started talking and I learned all kinds of valuable things. And so, and that goes very much in the sort of direction of, owning your feelings and admitting when something is hurting you or bothering you. This is like admitting that something is confusing you. Right.
A well-formed and well-timed question is more effective than any rant could ever be, in my opinion.
Oh, but the rants feel so good in the moment. Okay, we have another question in the Q&A. This approach reminds me of motivational interviewing, when you start with openness about the other person's position and ask questions that help you understand their perspective and perhaps get them to consider other options. Works well with engaging folks in substance use disorder treatment, but also in other areas of engagement in treatment, etc. Yes. So, especially in the work that I've done with healthcare providers, motivational interviewing comes up often as, a tool that people are trained in. I think there's a couple things that are, the question lays out all the similarities. I think there's a couple differences. I would say the main difference is that quite often when you're engaged in motivational interviewing, it's because there's a person in front of you who recognizes that they need to make a change, but they don't necessarily have the wherewithal to enact it all the way, right? So I want to lose weight, but I have all this, junk food in my house, or I want to quit smoking, but both the situation and my own sort of ability to control my behavior are getting in my way. What's a little bit different with a lot of these conversations is that the person who believes whatever it is they believe that's different than what you believe is perfectly happy believing it, right? They're not looking to change their behavior. They don't think there's anything wrong with them. They're fine. So there's a little bit, with motivational interviewing, you're really sort of trying to uncover the person's motivation and trying to bolster it and trying to help them remove the barriers to their success. Whereas with disagreement, a lot of what we're trying to say is, let's not start with the assumption that the other person is the one that's supposed to change their mind, because they might not appreciate that assumption coming through.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of the techniques in terms of really understanding the person's context and understanding where they're coming from are very, very parallel to motivational interviewing. Yes, I agree with that.
It just makes me think, Julia, about the value of planting seeds and allowing it the room to germinate, or for us, ourselves, to be fertile ground in which seeds can be planted. Because I want to be continually evolving, and I've found over the years that perspectives evolve, and they can evolve. They're fluid and can evolve based on life experiences, based on the maturation process, based on new information that is surfaced, or other manners of acquisition of knowledge. So you may plant a seed that may not germinate for days, weeks, months, or years. Or you could plant a seed that'll germinate in an hour. What you have to do is be patient with the process. And you also have to have the humility, as I said, to be fertile ground yourself. So a seed can be planted in you to help you evolve.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, I think we all come in from such a place of, again, and I don't think it's sort of wrong. It's almost inevitable. Like, you believe what you believe because everything about your life and your learning and the people you respect have led you to believe these things, right? And so the idea that you might have to give up on those things seems very, very unappealing. And so I think people do come into these conversations with like a very firm commitment to, I'm absolutely not changing my mind 100%, no way, no how. But that's not what you're talking about. Evolving is different than changing your mind or banning your positions. It's simply sort of developing a view that's more complex and more nuanced and sort of better reflects the incredible complexity of the world. All right,
Absolutely.
we have two more questions. Okay, so hold on. How can we encourage individuals to embrace a both and mentality? Oh, that's exactly what we were just talking about. And in what ways does this mindset potentially increase a person's ability to reduce polarization and generate greater unity with others? Ooh. I think this is one where, leading by example is an incredibly powerful thing, right? I think one of the things that has caused some of the deterioration in our public discourse over the last few years is that we've had some very unreceptive voices get tremendous prominence. And so that changes the norms. That changes the norms of what's appropriate and what's productive and what gets people, to achieve their goals. And, and so this is, conversational receptiveness, and the idea that people mimic conversational receptiveness essentially gives you an opportunity to create like a little pocket around yourself where people are civil because you model that example to them. And I think a lot of the behaviors we've been talking about today really set a tone in a room or in a workplace or in a community that, makes other people follow suit, because that becomes the norm.
And I think also, Julia, I think you're right on, but you also have to be good walking away. You have to be good with that. I talked with one of my children about this the other day. I said, the way to get to know somebody is not to talk about yourself ad nauseum, but to ask them questions and show an interest in them. But if they don't ask you questions back, you've got a real indication that they're not interested in getting to know you. So you can't really cultivate a relationship if you're just pinging and like an interview, I'll ask you a question and then you don't give me anything back. And it's the same thing in trying to have a receptive conversation. If you're displaying all these correct behaviors, the curiosity, the questioning, the sincerity, everything that's here with here, and that is not being reciprocated, you know where it's going, and it's okay to walk away. But if you're going to walk away, you have to walk away with the same comportment that you had in the conversation. You have to extract yourself with dignity and respect and thank people for their time and show them your appreciation. Because all too often we get offended and we walk off in a huff, or we have to lobby a parting shot as we leave. And that actually shows the truth of your posture.
Well, that to me sounds like a really great place to close on, is gracious walking away. Sometimes that's a really important thing to do.
No, I agree. And I wish I could say in every mediation, I walked away with an agreement, but I cannot. And people decide whether or not they want to agree. And we have to, or whether or not they even want to respect my perspective. And it's up to them. And I have to be good with that. And we all need to be good with that. Thank you.